Hello and welcome to Faith Talks. In today's program, we'll be talking about persecution. Joining me in the studio today is Pastor Sinisha Horvath and Mr. Mervyn Thomas, CEO of Christian Solidarity Worldwide. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mervyn, tell us first, what is Christian Solidarity Worldwide?
Okay, Christian Solidarity Worldwide is a Christian organisation, as it sounds. We're a religious freedom organisation working through advocacy and human rights in the pursuit of justice. So we are basically speaking out for Christians who are persecuted for their faith, but also others who are persecuted for their faith, whatever that might be. Although we are very overtly a Christian organisation, nevertheless we speak out for all who are persecuted for what they believe in.
How would you today define persecution? And I'm going to ask both of you because we might have two different answers. Sinisha, how would you define persecution?
Well, I guess that would be when you are really physically threatened because of your beliefs. That would be kind of a little bit different from being just discriminated from. But I in my head, lay understanding that would be the persecution.
What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit like bullying in that it's almost bullying or persecution is in the eye of the beholder, and so I guess you would have to do it on a scale. If you lost your job because you were wearing a cross or because you refused to register a gay marriage, you might feel that you were discriminated against. Well, you would be discriminated against, but you might feel that you were persecuted. Whereas somebody in North Korea, for example, would actually expect that in the first place, and what they would describe as persecution would be thrown into a prison camp or even executed for their faith. So there's a whole range of persecution. What we do know is that Jesus said, if they hated me, they'll hate you as well. And so we can expect to be hated, and I guess we can expect persecution, whether it's number 1 on the scale or whether it's number 10.
And I think, we are seeing very much more in the media with Christians being persecuted around the world. I mean, lately we've seen a case of a Sudanese woman who has been thrown in jail because she converted to Christianity and is expected to be executed for her belief because she married somebody who was Christian, and even though they now have the second child, there's a big story there, and it's happening at the moment. But that's on this one end of the scale, and as you were saying, wearing a cross is on the other end of the scale in a way. But what do you think, Sinisha? You grew up in a communist country and saw different types of persecution in the West, because let's be honest, in the West most of us are not experiencing the extreme levels of persecution. But Sinisha, tell us your journey.
Yes, I think you are rightly pointing there are degrees, but what often is interesting that the person who is persecuted or discriminated does not even know often how to define it. It's just like being a victim of domestic violence. You may think this is normal, this is how the thing should be. And I know you asked me that question a few weeks ago, have I been persecuted? And I said, no, I haven't been persecuted. I was maybe discriminated against. But thinking of it now, I was persecuted for my faith. I remember when I chose to change my faith, I was more like a nominal Catholic, even though I never was a Catholic. I was more a secular person. But people had a strong opinion. I remember I was even spat on the street because somebody said, "How could you change your faith?" And I was faithless before that, in that sense. But people did put a pressure. I was called by the teachers and tried to be, bullied by them almost. You can't do that, and also when I went to the army, it was a very difficult. You ostracized. You even called as a. I remember I was told that I was a fifth column, a quisling, I'm a danger to our society. So there was a lot of threats, a lot of, I think, persecution. And I certainly know my friend who is actually living not far from me. He was imprisoned because of his faith. And not only imprisoned, it was not enough for them to do that. And he was imprisoned for a month. And then every night they would put 2 thugs with him who would beat him up all night. So, and that's not in the 19th century, not in the Nazi Germany. This is in the late 1980s, early 90s.
I think it's interesting because you actually define persecution as something physical, yet what you are saying is there's also an emotional and experience of being persecuted that is different than just beaten.
Yeah. Yes, and this is probably what I still struggle with myself, because I feel a bit guilty to say I was persecuted when you compare myself with North Korean people, or with that lady in Sudan who had to give a birth in chains just because she happens to be a Christian. So it always makes you a little bit, you want to fall back on it because, you cannot measure your persecution with those. So it's very difficult. It's a fine line what persecution is. Depends where you are, which society you are in. But I think we also need to help the victims because they often think this is a normal thing.
Yeah, I mean, in many respects, it is normal for a Christian, or should be normal for a Christian. Sometimes I provocatively, speaking in churches in the UK, say, why aren't we being persecuted? Because, in fact, in I think it's the first epistle of John, we read that if you want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus, you will be persecuted. It's a fact. And in point of fact, when you travel to countries, as I do, where Christians are overtly persecuted, when you travel to places like Iran, to Nigeria, to North Korea, to China, many other places, India, Pakistan, these people, when they convert to Christianity, when they become a Christian, when they make a decision to follow Christ, they expect to be persecuted because that's what it says in the Bible. We can expect persecution. So, in fact, they are ready for it. In this country and in Western countries, we don't have to experience that, and so we're not ready for it. And so, at the first sort of whiff of any kind of problem, we run away and are frightened by it.
And I think that you are working so much with countries outside of the UK, and as you're saying, persecution is to be expected for Christians. Yeah. Yet, tell me a little bit about what are some of the ways that you are helping those who are persecuted, and what are the types of persecution that you come across?
Okay, well, it is many and varied, and in fact, actually 74% of the world's population, which is a huge amount, 3/4 of the world's population, live in countries which have high or very high restrictions on freedom of religion. That includes, of course, Christians and other faiths too, but Christians are the most persecuted faith in the world today. And that persecution can come from governments, or it can come from society. It can come from attacks from other religious groups or whatever, or it can come from government control. And so it ranges from, as we talked about North Korea earlier, where thousands upon thousands of Christians over the last 4 decades have been executed simply for following Jesus. Many of them have died in most awful prison camps. Then, of course, you've got places like Nigeria at the moment, where Nigeria, of course, is a country split in two, really. The south, which is very overtly Christian, and the north, which is overtly Muslim. And so, and it's in the north where the Christians live in amongst the Muslims, where we've seen many, many attacks. And, of course, in the last 2 or 3 years, the emergence of the Boko Haram terrorist group, who are an Islamist group who are killing Christians indiscriminately, and destroying churches, bombing churches. And so you've got that. You've got places like Iran, which is a theocracy and which is trying to impose Islamic and Sharia law on Christians. And yet, in all of those places, well, perhaps not North Korea, but certainly in Nigeria, in places like Iran, the church is growing enormously, and yet Christians are thrown in prison. They're given. There was a case a couple of years ago of a pastor given the death sentence for apostasy. And so it's many and varied. What we do in Christian Solidarity Worldwide is we travel to these countries, we take first-hand accounts of the testimony of people, and then we present those to governments. So we work in Westminster with parliamentarians and with the government. We work in Brussels at the EU, on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., at the United Nations. I mean, an example of where we have worked and seen some success. And I have to say that often our success is very small steps towards a much bigger goal. We, for example, 6 years ago produced a report on North Korea. Nobody was talking about North Korea. Nobody even realised what was going on. We produced that report and we've been working very, very hard at all kinds of levels, raising awareness. And eventually last year the United Nations appointed a commission of inquiry into war crimes. Not war crimes, crimes against humanity. And the report, which came out just a couple of months ago, was very clear that yes, crimes against humanity are going on in North Korea. Of course, our next step is to get the Security Council and get people to approve that so that we can make a difference on the ground. So it's a long, convoluted process very often, but we feel that we have to speak out, raise awareness, so that a difference can be made.
And you're saying it's not just overnight success either.
Very much so. No.
It must be difficult also to get into some of these countries if people know who you are and knowing what work you do.
Yeah, it can be very difficult, and yes, and so we have to find ways around that.
And we will not ask about those ways. But tell me a bit. I was a bit struck by what you said, that churches seems to be growing in countries where persecution is more ripe. Why is that?
I think in many respects what I just said about the fact that when in some of these countries, people, when they make a decision to follow Christ, it's real, because they know what follows. It's not an identity thing. It's not a social thing. It's going to church is not like going to the tennis club. It's a real life-changing experience where you expect persecution. So China is a tremendous example of where the church has grown amidst persecution. You know, maybe something like 130 million Christians in China today. The church growing phenomenally, more Christians than communists, but that's been through persecution. And I think it's because people see it's a life-changing experience, and people are not going to go back. Our churches, people sometimes, you have to be very careful not to generalise, but very often the church is a sort of moving community, and people come and go, but they don't there. When they make a decision to follow Christ, it affects their whole life, and they want to win others for Christ too.
I think it's often difficult to understand what you just said from our Anglo-Saxon perspective, where you know, following Christ is often in a realm of ideas. You know, you have taught this way, and now you are choosing that way. But in many other countries, even in where I come from, in Eastern Europe, the religion is a way of life. It's a lifestyle that is deeply rooted in the culture. And when you choose to follow Christ, you are making a dramatic change in your life, and which causes all kind of reaction from the society, from the community you live in, which provokes often either persecution or that controversy. And I like to. Even as a pastor, I just find it surprising with what ease people become Christians, because you pay a huge price for that. And the other thing that we miss often is we like to think that when you meet Christ, there is some sort of nirvana following up, there is that peace, and which is true. But following Christ is often moving into life, living in tension You know, you are stretched in a between. You know, you always are asked to make difficult decisions. You are provoked. And I like to say that if you had not been deeply troubled, deeply asked to get out of your comfort zone at the point of meeting Christ, if that hasn't happened, you probably have not met him.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's very true, and I think, you know, we sometimes mistake, or people mistake, freedom of worship with being the same as freedom of religion. Now, let me explain that, because when you make a decision to follow Christ, it doesn't mean you go to church and sing hymns or pray. It means much more than that. It's a life changer. It means that you take your religion, you take your Christianity out into the community. You want to win others for Christ. You want to make a difference, whether it's healthcare or whether it's in education, whatever it is. And so people often talk about, well, there is freedom of worship, and we think that's a good idea. I used to think, great, freedom of worship. But no, what they mean by freedom of worship is being able to come together in four walls, in private, to worship God. What we mean by freedom of religion is that life-changing thing that takes us out into the community, making a difference, and that's real freedom of religion. And that's where Christians, when they make this decision to follow Christ, it means exactly that. It means following Christ's example.
It reminded me just what you said in the 80s when I was following, just decided to make that dramatic change in my life. I was told, in our country, there is a freedom of religion. You can do whatever you want within your four walls.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it was. They didn't want baptisms in the rivers. They wouldn't allow you anything outside. But they thought that they are giving you full rights to follow your religion, which is not quite what you just described.
That's interesting that there's such a difference, because in many people's minds, those two are merged in together, and we're not seeing the difference of what that actually means, because we live in a country where that is not a problem.
Yeah.
Well, it has not been so far. Then, if we're talking a little bit about the Western world and our approach to persecution and freedom of religion and freedom of worship, it's very easy, if I'm not getting my way of worshiping, then I am persecuted or discriminated against. How can we move beyond that? How can we move and embrace a larger picture or understanding of persecution?
Well, you mean persecution in the West?
No,
or
generally.
Generally. I mean, I think that, we are told in Hebrews 13, verse 3, that we should remember our fellow Christians as if we were those in prison, as if we were in prison with them. 1 Corinthians 12:26 talks about being part of the body of Christ. When one part suffers, every part suffers. And then in Proverbs 30:31 we read that we are to speak out for those who are unable to speak out for themselves. The Bible makes it abundantly clear that this persecution that affects part of our family should affect us all. And so you're right, we need to embrace that, and the way to embrace it in a free country in which we live is actually, how can we participate? How can we feel the pain that our fellow believers? We need to exercise our voices much more. We need to shine a light in the darkness. There are dark places on this earth where Christians are persecuted terribly. We need to shine a light on that, and that is our duty. Speak up for those who are unable to speak for themselves, and it's something that we can all do. We ask people in Christian Solidarity Worldwide, we ask people to do 3 things, all beginning with P. We ask them to pray, which is the number one priority. Wherever I go in the world, when I say to people, what can we do for you? The very first thing, always, it's not go and speak to the President or the Prime Minister, it's please pray. That's number one. The second thing is to protest. And, we've talked this morning about Miriam, Miriam Ibrahim in Sudan, who's under the sentence of death. Also, incidentally, not just under the sentence of death, she's also been sentenced to 100 lashes. And that's something that we tend to forget about. That's a lesser sentence, but in many respects, it's a worse sentence. Death happens very quickly. I know 2 men in Iran, for example, that were given 80 lashes just before Christmas. Their crime was drinking communion wine at a communion service. And so we can protest about those things. And we've had using the social media, Facebook and Twitter, we have had tens of thousands of people join our campaign for Miriam in Sudan. And so we can protest, and it will and does make a difference, coupled with prayer. The third thing is to provide. We can provide for these people. One of the ways that we encourage Christians to provide for one another is by sending letters and cards of encouragement to people who are in prison or the families of victims. And the fourth thing we ask people to do is to proclaim, tell other people what's going on in the world so that they too can pray, protest and provide. So that's how we can embrace this and get involved.
I think that takes it beyond just, I like that we start with prayer, but we go beyond that because you can also just say, well, I'm praying about it.
Exactly.
And the Bible tells us that we should turn our other cheek when we are getting persecuted or when people are harassing us. We should thank God. And people might argue that, if we start protesting too much, are we not just going against the Bible? What do you think?
It's a very good question, and it's a debatable point, but I don't think we are, because I've just quoted you 3 verses that tell us that we should speak out and that we should suffer with them, that we should God is a God of justice, and I think if you are being persecuted, then you have a duty to turn the other cheek. So, I've had this discussion with Nigerians, for example, in northern Nigeria, who are constantly attacked by Islamists and others who say, look, we've turned the cheek once, we've turned the cheek twice, how many more times have we got to turn the cheek? You have to say to them, I'm afraid you've got to keep turning the cheek. But it doesn't mean that I, as another believer who is not experiencing that, can't speak up against the injustice. And that's the difference, I think. I remember going to Egypt and meeting the last Pope of the Orthodox Church in Egypt, Pope Shenouda, who died a couple of years ago. And Pope Shenouda said to me, we've been persecuted as Christians, we've been persecuted since St. Mark was dragged through the streets of Alexandria by his neck. And we accept that persecution and we don't speak out. My answer to Pope Shenouda was, you might not speak out, but I'm going to speak out and I'm going to shout it from the rooftops.
Yeah. I certainly don't think that we should go and court the trouble just because. Yeah. But we also should not forget that the early Christian movement was a very radical movement, and the Roman Empire knew that it is undermining the society to the core. And this is why they were against it. And I take the example of Mahatma Gandhi, with his non-violent movement, which is born from his religion. And he knew what is the power of the word. He said, he proclaimed non-violence, and the British government realized the danger. So they wanted to provoke him into violence, and they knew that this is far more powerful weapon. Which eventually brought the independence of India. And I think this is where we are. We are here. We just can't. The Christian message is a deeply subversive message to those governments that try to court with this way of doing things.
Can I just very quickly give you an example of the Christian way of both acting, but also is so very powerful. Now, a very good friend of mine, Yunusa, who is actually runs CSW in Nigeria, he pastors a church in a 99% Muslim area. Now, in Kaduna, and in Kaduna a couple of years ago, every single Sunday during the summer, bombs went off in different churches. And Yunusa's response was this. He got his congregation together. They made up food parcels, which they took to the local mosques for the poor Muslim families to be able to celebrate the breaking of the Ramadan fast. What an amazing response. I like to believe that's what Jesus would have done. And it showed love, but it also completely disarmed the local imams and Muslims who didn't know how to react to it, except to say, these Christians are good people, leave them alone.
And I think just here to close off our time today, could you just sum up very briefly, what has it done to your personal faith journey when you experienced discriminations, borderline persecution?
I think it really fortified my faith in many ways. I have paid a huge price personally, I believe, which makes it you less likely to waver, because you don't take it lightly. The price that you paid, it's like buying something very expensive and precious. You don't just go and throw it somewhere aside. And to me, this is it. Even when you have a time when you feel lethargic and lazy, it reminds you, the price that you paid, and that keeps you, holds you. And I think that's the power. As you have said, that persecution often actually increases, makes it really real, that Christianity that we all talk about.
And just briefly, what about your journey, faith journey, in your work?
Well, often people say to me, it must be the most depressing job in the world, but it's not. It's the most inspirational job in the world, because over the last 35 years that I've been working with persecuted Christians, I've been inspired beyond belief by people who have responded in the kind of ways that I've talked today, who have got a real faith. In fact, sometimes when I come back to this country, I feel almost that I go into our churches to preach, and I feel we're playing at being Christians sometimes, that it's somehow not as real. So what it's done for my faith journey, it's inspired me, it's made me put into perspective my tiny little troubles compared to our brethren and sisters overseas who really suffer incredibly.
I want to say thank you to both of you for joining me in the studio and having such an important discussion with us today. And why not add your voice to the debate by joining us on our Facebook page @Faith Talks. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.